A single trade decision has triggered an economic earthquake across America. When the United States imposed a devastating 50% tariff on Canadian copper imports, Canada responded with surgical precision, cutting off all lumber exports to their southern neighbor. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Construction projects ground to a halt, housing costs soared, and an entire industry found itself fighting for survival. This isn't just another trade dispute buried in economic newspapers. This crisis is reshaping how Americans build homes, renovate properties, and plan for the future. The ripple effects are being felt from corporate boardrooms to family kitchen tables, and the full impact is only beginning to unfold. Understanding this crisis requires recognizing lumber's critical role in American construction. This isn't simply about wood products. Lumber forms the structural backbone of virtually every residential and commercial building project across the United States. From the basic framing that gives homes their shape to the finishing touches that make spaces livable, lumber is irreplaceable. The numbers tell a stark story. Approximately 75% of the lumber used in American construction comes directly from Canadian forests. This relationship developed over decades based on practical economics. Canada possesses vast timber resources, established milling operations, and efficient transportation networks that could deliver high-quality softwood lumber at competitive prices. This cross-border partnership enabled American builders to maintain affordable housing costs while meeting growing demand. Canadian lumber allowed developers to construct homes for middle-class families, contractors to bid competitively on projects, and homeowners to afford renovations and improvements. The system worked seamlessly until political tensions intervened. When Canada halted lumber exports, the American construction industry faced an unprecedented supply shock. Within days, domestic lumber prices increased by more than 30%. Projects that were economically viable on Monday became financially impossible by Friday. The impact struck different sectors with varying intensity. Large construction companies like D.R. Horton and Lennar, which had planned extensive residential developments across multiple states, were forced to delay or cancel projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. These weren't minor adjustments to construction schedules. Entire communities that expected new housing developments found themselves with empty lots and broken promises. Small contractors faced even more severe consequences. Unlike major corporations, family-owned construction businesses cannot absorb sudden material cost increases. Many had already committed to fixed-price contracts based on previous lumber costs. When prices skyrocketed overnight, these contractors found themselves losing money on every project they completed. The housing market responded immediately. New home prices increased by an average of $20,000 solely due to lumber costs. For first-time buyers already struggling with high mortgage rates and limited inventory, this additional expense pushed homeownership beyond reach. Real estate agents reported a surge in canceled contracts as buyers were priced out of markets they had been preparing to enter for months. Canada's decision to halt lumber exports wasn't an impulsive reaction. It represented the culmination of mounting frustration with American trade policies. The copper tariff was merely the final provocation in a series of trade disputes that had strained the relationship between the two nations. Canadian officials had already endured tariffs on aluminum and steel exports. Behind the scenes, they had been preparing for the possibility that trade tensions would escalate further. When rumors circulated about potential pharmaceutical tariffs, Canadian policymakers recognized they needed to demonstrate that such actions would have serious consequences. Lumber was chosen strategically because it would create maximum impact with minimal harm to Canadian interests. The country's forestry industry had already been exploring alternative markets in Asia, partly as a hedge against American trade volatility. When the export halt was announced, Canadian companies quickly redirected shipments to ports in China, Japan, and South Korea. This pivot wasn't merely opportunistic. Canadian provinces provided practical support through reduced export fees and streamlined permitting processes for Asian-bound shipments. What began as a retaliatory measure evolved into a long-term strategic repositioning away from dependence on American markets. While policymakers debated tariff strategies, ordinary Americans began experiencing the real-world consequences of the lumber crisis. The effects extended far beyond construction sites into daily life in ways most people hadn't anticipated. Home renovation projects that families had been planning for years became unaffordable overnight. A kitchen remodel that might have cost $15,000 suddenly required $25,000. Homeowners postponed essential repairs to roofs and structural elements because the materials were simply too expensive. The crisis affected more than just construction materials. Lumber is used in manufacturing furniture, cabinets, fencing, and countless household items. As supply chains adjusted to higher costs, prices increased across a broad range of consumer goods. Families noticed the difference in everything from garden supplies to office furniture. Construction workers faced the most immediate hardship. Projects that provided steady employment disappeared as contractors canceled contracts they couldn't afford to complete. Skilled tradespeople found themselves unemployed, not because of lack of demand, but because the materials needed to do their jobs had become prohibitively expensive. The crisis exposed deep divisions in American political leadership. While some officials demanded even more aggressive tariffs as retaliation against Canada, others recognized that the lumber shortage was harming American consumers and businesses more than it was pressuring Canadian negotiators. Congressional representatives from states heavily dependent on construction faced particular pressure. Lawmakers from Michigan, Ohio, and Texas found themselves caught between supporting their party's trade policies and protecting constituents whose livelihoods depended on affordable building materials. The political gridlock prevented decisive action precisely when speed was essential. Each day of delay allowed Canadian companies to strengthen relationships with Asian buyers and made the eventual restoration of trade more difficult. What began as a negotiating tactic was becoming a permanent restructuring of North American commerce. The lumber crisis represents more than a temporary trade dispute. It demonstrates how interconnected modern economies have become and how quickly political decisions can disrupt established commercial relationships. Canada's success in redirecting lumber exports to Asian markets proves that alternative trading partnerships can develop rapidly when traditional relationships become unreliable. Once Canadian companies establish efficient supply chains to serve Asian construction markets, they may have little incentive to return to the volatility of American trade politics. For the United States, the crisis highlights the vulnerability of depending heavily on imports for critical materials. American construction companies are learning painful lessons about supply chain diversification and the hidden costs of trade conflicts. The ultimate resolution of this crisis will require more than simply lifting tariffs. It will demand rebuilding trust between trading partners and acknowledging that in modern economies, aggressive trade policies often harm domestic industries as much as foreign competitors. Until political leaders on both sides recognize these realities, American families will continue paying higher prices for homes, renovations, and basic construction materials, while Canadian lumber finds new markets across the Pacific.